Are you an introvert working and living in a world that seems to value extroverts more? Would you like to learn how to navigate your life and nursing career and see your introversion as a superpower? Well, let's talk about it with my guest, Sarah Santacroce, who's with us all the way from Geneva, Switzerland, right here on episode 206 of The Nurse Keith Show. Well, hello and welcome to the Nurse Keith Show. I am so grateful, as always, that you're listening, whether it's your first time tuning in or you've been hanging out with me here on the airwaves for months or years. Thanks for being part of the growing Nurse Keith Nation. This podcast is all about you and your nursing career, and I'm here to share education, inspiration, and ideas that can get you moving in a positive and very inspired direction. Meanwhile, if you want to see the show notes for this episode, you can follow along at nursekeith.com/the word episode and the number 206. Can you believe it? 206. Anyway, my guest today is my good friend, Sarah Santacroce, who is here with us from Switzerland. She's a LinkedIn specialist and a mentor of many, many people for many, many purposes. We're going to talk about so many different subjects. Sarah, thank you for being here with us.
It's a great pleasure to talk to you, my friend.
Oh, nice thank you so much. So, Sarah, you're an introvert, right?
Yeah. Wow. You go right into it. You're like, yep.
Yep. You're an introvert. And I'm what I call an ambivert. I kind of toggle back and forth based on circumstances and how I feel. For people out in the professional world who are introverts, what are the greatest challenges for people when they're trying to be successful professionals and they're on the introverted side?
I think there's so many challenges, and yet I want to start with a positive note, saying that I think it's gotten actually much easier to be an introvert in today's day and age. Ever since Susan Cain's book came out, Quiet, it's more talked about, and maybe there's a little bit more understanding about what introversion means. So that's the positive note. And then yes, of course, there's challenges, especially I guess if you're in a corporate situation or, working in a hospital where there's all these expectations of how you are supposed to show up. And let's face it, especially in the United States, the expectation is kind of like you're outgoing, you're cheerful, and that's the picture of an extrovert,
right?
Where the picture of an introvert is more reserved and quiet, and it's the opposite, right? And so I think that is definitely challenging in professional situations where maybe you don't always speak up because you're just kind of quietly reflecting on things, and then it's perceived the wrong way. They think, you're not smart enough, or you don't lead, or where actually you're just reflecting. And if nobody asks you, you're not going to share your opinion. But if you're asked, often you're probably the smartest in the room. You just don't share it as often as extroverts. Maybe.
I bet you're often the smartest person in the room, Sarah.
That's not what I meant, but you get my point.
I do get your point. So, for let's say our listener out there who is tuning in right now, and she's a nurse and she works on a busy unit in a fairly large hospital, and she has to interact with medical residents and fellows and nurses and physical therapists and families and patients and food service people. I mean, it's outrageous the number of people and conversations and contact that, let's say, a nurse on a unit like that encounters every day. And for an introverted nurse, and someone listening might be this person right now, that must be, I can only imagine how hard that can be for someone who's really introverted, but they want to be really good at their job. So one of the things you teach people, and I know you have a new branch of your business you're bringing out, right, is to help fellow introverts market their business with authenticity and without anxiety, and to sell their services or be a professional out in the world and make a difference, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you also have a podcast, which I've listened to many times. It's the Introvert Biz Growth Podcast. And this is really about entrepreneurship, but there's a lot in there about introverts too. And I'm wondering, when you encounter people out there who are introverts and they feel labeled, because we often associate extroversion with success, right? Someone who becomes president or prime minister or a movie star or something like that. And people often see people who are introverted as living a small life. So for those people out there who are introverts but want to live a big life, like they really want to be present in life, what are some of the secrets to doing that, making that happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, actually, it's a misconception that only extroverts are successful. I'm sure you know that, but you mentioned presidents. Well, Obama, for example, he's declared himself publicly that he's an introvert. And so are other, big names like Bill Gates and Zuckerberg and Warren Buffett, for example. So these are all introverts who, if you look at their life in the traditional definition of success, well, they are definitely successful. So it's not true at all that only extroverts are successful. I think what sometimes is super challenging for introverts is this struggle between both, right? They're hugely ambitious and they want to live a big life, and yet they prefer the quiet. So yet they prefer the backstage and not the front stage. So to find a balance where you can be a quiet leader, I think that is what is really challenging for introverts. And a lot of them succeed, but usually it's because they have a partner in crime, or they have a team, or, that they have this other person that will take over the more extroverted roles. But even if I think of Obama, he was great on stage. Mm-hmm. But I think after that happens to a lot of introverts, they're actually good on stage. So we don't necessarily all fear to be on stage, but once we step off the stage, then it's like, oh, let me just go back to my room and be quiet rather than mingle with everybody. So
right.
So yeah, I think it's a misconception, of course, but I also think that it is probably one of the biggest struggles of introverts, because they're big thinkers, right? They conceptualize everything in their head, because we're often living in our head. And so a lot of introverts are visionaries, but then that usually comes with the weight of expectations from society, because it's like, well, you're a visionary. Well, then, you have to go out and speak, and you have to, do all these. But like, for example, Susan Cain, who wrote this book, Quiet, I'm sure she never expected that she's going to be this big celebrity and now has to fly around and do speeches everywhere. So it's a struggle between wanting big things and then getting there. And then it's like, well, did I really sign up for this?
Right.
Or did
what
I
have
just
I done?
Yeah, I wanted to just write a book and quietly in my office.
Right.
Yeah.
Like next month, I'm going to speak in front of probably 300 or 400 nurses at a nurse leadership conference in Atlanta, Georgia. And I used to call myself an introvert, but like I said earlier, I now call myself an ambivert, a term someone taught me recently, because my understanding of introverts and extroverts is that introverts get their energy from solitude and recharging their batteries, and extroverts, to a large extent, this is what I understand, and I know it's a generalization, get their energy and their charge from people, like from interacting with other people. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So like when I go to a conference, I'm very comfortable on stage, actually. And I'm actually comfortable mingling unless there's something going on for me emotionally that makes me quite internal. And my wife, Mary, could attest that sometimes we go to parties and I'm really talkative and hanging out with people. And other times I'm kind of sitting in the corner. And it all depends where I'm at. And I try not to judge myself for it. And I'm looking at Susan Cain's book right now. It's C-A-I-N, Susan Cain. It's called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. I'm going to have to download that to my Kindle. So thanks for telling me about it. And that's true. People love to talk, whether it's online, on social media, or like me, kind of gabbing on and on right now. We all many of us like to talk. And I've often referred to this notion of we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we listen twice as much as we speak. But
Right.
maybe extroverts sometimes feel like they have 2 mouths and 1 ear. I don't know.
Yeah, it's true that on my podcast, I always ask my guests who are all introverts what they think their superpower is. And so many times the superpower of active listening comes up. So yeah, it's definitely something that we're very good at. My husband, Tony, he agrees with the listening part, but he's like, yeah, but speak sometimes too.
Say something.
Say something. So, yeah, I guess it has always 2 sides.
That's true. That's true. And you said like 10 minutes ago about how sometimes an introvert has an extrovert around them who kind of helps them navigate the world. Right.
Yeah,
and maybe sometimes translates the world for them or translates them to the world. And I'm thinking of spouses, actually.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm thinking of people I know where one partner is super extroverted and the other is pretty darn introverted. And that can be a nice balance, actually, if they can come to terms with their differences, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like a lot of things in a partnership. It's just understanding the differences and then finding the balance, like you said.
Right.
My husband is actually introverted as well, but then there's all these different types of introverts, like Myers-Briggs, the personality types. There's the different letters, and so he actually really enjoys talking at parties and things like that, where me, not so much. So it also depends what type you are in terms of the Myers-Briggs personality types.
That's a really good point, right? I actually really like Myers-Briggs. It's, none of these tests are the be all and end all, but they do give us information, and information is helpful. And even though they're generalizations, they're often very applicable. I think if I used to be an INTJ in Myers-Briggs, and I think if I retook it now, I might be more of an extrovert. I'm not sure, but it would be interesting to take it. And
yeah, take it again.
Yeah, and you just mentioned partnerships, like we were talking about spouses. So if we extrapolate that, if we expand that out to, let's say, a nurse manager or supervisor in an agency or on a unit, doesn't really matter the milieu. So let's take a nurse supervisor who's introverted and he's actually quite heart-centered, and you work with heart-centered entrepreneurs and you help them kind of find their gentle way of being in the world, right? So for a nurse leader or even a nurse executive who is an introvert, how can they embrace a gentle style of leadership and being in that type of position of authority and still be effective and still make themselves heard? How do they go about that? What's some strategies that can be incorporated?
I think it all has to do with already being aware of, your personality type and actually be confident and feel good with that. Because if you keep comparing yourself to others and think, I'm not as authoritative and, I need to show more power, then you're probably going to lead the wrong way. However, if you know your personality type, your values, and really just deeply know who you are, then I think you will show up with confidence. And even though it's a quiet confidence, people can always tell that there's something that just kind of, they're attracted to that kind of quiet energy. And it all has to do with being, I don't know if you've read Brené Brown's recent book, Dare to Lead. It's a really good book that I would recommend.
Some of it, but not the whole thing. I'm going to put Susan Cain's book and the Brené Brown book in the show notes. So Dare to Lead by Brené Brown.
Yeah, exactly. Because she really talks about this courage to be vulnerable. And so if you think of a quiet leader, well, showing up with vulnerability and just, I think for an introvert, it's almost easier to show up like that because there's less, I don't know what it is. It's just like, it's less of these expectations, I think, that people have from you. And so if you show up with this courage, people will immediately respond to that and just kind of be attracted to that energy.
I see. Okay. So if introverts do really have superpowers in terms of their ability, let's say, to be empathic, but I'm sure extroverts are empathic too. Of course, I'm not casting aspersions on extroverts. They're great people too and do good work in the world. But for an introvert who is gentle, who's heart-centered, who's quiet, who's reserved, what are some of the other superpowers that they can bring forward, especially, let's say, in a somewhat conflictual workplace or stressful workplace where there's a lot happening and a lot of personalities and complex webs of relationships in teams, for instance. You have like the internal team struggles and relationships, then you have the relationships between the teams. So if you have one of these nurse leaders out there, how can they actually manage themselves outside of, say, their little team where they're known more, and let's say going into a bigger milieu, what do they have to do in order to maintain their sense of self and be authentic, but still be present in a very large type of organization?
So let me just make sure that I got the question. So you're saying which kind of superpowers do they rely on in order to lead their teams?
I'm looking actually beyond the team to, let's say, in a very large organization, like say a nurse who works in, let's see, Johns Hopkins, which is a huge medical center with thousands of employees. So is there something else that leader, that nurse has to bring forward in order to function well and be successful in that big organization beyond their small team, let's say on the unit where they're stationed?
Well, what came to mind is the big picture thinking that introverts are really good at, where the extroverts are really good at acting and, putting into action, right?
Right.
So just kind of, if they get this space, because they need to be able to, actually have the space and have the creativity. That's another thing that introverts are really good at. They're very creative. And if they get the space to kind of go deep and come up with a big picture plan, let's say to, innovate or restructure or something kind of bigger than them, then I think that's where introverts are thriving, where the extrovert is really good at then putting into place.
Oh, right? I see. So the introvert can be, we could say, is the thinker, the planner, the strategic person behind the scenes, possibly. Okay. So someone who's introverted who wants to lead, but doesn't really like getting up and speaking in front of the 47 people on the team might want to find a position where maybe they don't have to do that very much and they can lead from behind. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. Or again, find that partner in crime and just say, one of the team members. And usually the extroverts, maybe, they're a grade lower or something like that. They actually really appreciate that. They're like, wow, he's letting me, do the speaking.
Oh, I see.
And the other person does comes up with the presentation maybe, but then someone else does the speaking. So
I see. So the introvert kind of gives the gift of being out front to the extrovert. And it's
exactly.
like, you take it. Here's the mic.
Yeah, I don't want it here.
I'll be in the office.
Yes.
I'm going to make some coffee. Right. So now we're going to take a pause for the cause for just a moment. Please consider becoming a patron of the Nurse Keith Show, just like other listeners who value the show so much that they want to give just a little bit each month to support the work we're doing here. When you pledge, you not only get the satisfaction of helping produce and support the show, you also get some pretty nifty premiums and gifts directly from yours truly. Just head over to patreon.com/Nurse Keith to read all about it. That's patreon.com/Nurse Keith. Also, please consider signing up for my newsletter at nursekeith.com so that you can receive my bi-weekly message just for you. Finally, if someone you know could benefit from career coaching with me, please consider referring them. And if they become a paying client, even if they do one session, you'll receive credit for 1 hour of coaching with me, and there's no expiration date on that credit, and you can keep it in your back pocket until you need it most. Remember that you can refer as many people as you like and continue to earn those coaching credits over time. What a deal! Those are my sincere asks of you, dear listener. So now let's dig back into today's topic. So if we switch gears from a leader to an employee, and let's say there's a listener out there who's a leader and she knows that there are 2 people on her team who are very introverted. Like when there's team meetings, these 2 people never say anything. And even if she knows they have concerns, they don't bring them up in the group because they're afraid to speak. And a lot of introverts can just feel that they just can't find their voice to be able to speak in a large group. So if that person's the leader and looking at these employees thinking, wow, these are good employees, they're great nurses, but I need them to communicate. What can she do to draw them out? Or does she need to change the way she approaches them so that they can communicate with her or with anyone?
Right. Yeah, sometimes it's just a matter of asking, because introverts, they tend to think, well, my opinion doesn't matter as much, or why would I speak up? It's not as important. And so just asking, hey, Keith, what do you think about this? And then when they're, actually getting the attention, if they feel safe in the environment, then they'll, usually what happens is because they listen to everyone else, they'll just come up with this like one-liner that summarizes the whole 1 hour meeting, right? And everybody goes, oh, okay.
Right.
So just ask them. That's I guess the first advice. Or if you see that they're really just uncomfortable, and that's not introversion, that's usually also something else like just social anxiety, or that's not typical to introversion to not want to speak, right? Let's not generalize, but if they just don't feel like speaking in the group, then it's probably good to have a private conversation with them.
That was where I was wondering if you were going to go. So if I'm a leader and I know that these 2 nurses they're not going to speak up in a meeting, even though I know they have awesome ideas. So maybe the way I can give a gift to them is to say, hey, can we meet in my office just one-on-one and talk about what happened in the meeting? And maybe that would draw them out, give them the space to speak in a situation that's more comfortable. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, I wouldn't say what happened in the meeting. I would just say I'd love to hear your opinion. But
right.
Probably what the challenges with that is that we're always short on time, right? And that's it depends on the structure, depends on the hospital, but unfortunately, there's probably never enough time to have a private conversation with everyone. But ideally, for an introvert, yes, that feels much safer to do that one-on-one.
Sure.
Can even be just in the elevator, or at the coffee. It doesn't have to be like this official meeting, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Right. So maybe casual might work better for some introverted people because they don't feel on the spot.
Yes.
Yeah. They don't feel like they're up against a wall and they have to deliver because you've cornered them in your office and you're ready for them to speak. So there's all sorts of introverts, right? There's some who actually do like speaking and do like small groups. Maybe they don't like large groups, for instance, or there's probably all sorts of permutations of how it shows up. And I'm curious, the 21st century workplace, we were just talking about Susan Cain's book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. So in a world that can't stop talking, in this modern 21st century workplace where communication and information is sort of everything now, do we need a revolution where gentleness is seen as a sign of strength? And if we do need a revolution like that, how do we actually make it happen? Big
I
question.
don't know. How do we make it happen? I'm starting my own revolution because I definitely think we do need a revolution. So what I'm doing is I'm calling it the gentle business revolution because that's where I act and that's where I have tiny chance of having an impact with entrepreneurs who also feel that the business world just keeps on getting more or less kind, I would say, less kind. And people just use the excuse, it's just business or it's not personal.
It's not personal.
Just business.
I'm going to stab you in the back, but it's not personal. Right.
Yes. So I definitely think there needs to be a paradigm shift and I can do that with entrepreneurs. And I think the time is right. And I see that there's definitely an interest for that. I really hope we get to the same conclusion in the corporate world, in the political world,
yes.
Kind of everywhere. But I see it with my husband who's in the corporate world and it's just, it's got to stop. We're just about at the tip of the iceberg because it cannot continue. Eventually we're just going to drown and it's not going to continue like that. But the question is when and who's going to start that revolution? I know I can't. So
I think you are. I think you are actually because
on a small level, maybe.
Small level, but then you throw a rock in water and it ripples out, right? So you have the Introvert Biz Growth podcast and you help people who are business people be authentic and not experience so much anxiety in the world. And you have some amazing conversations with these people. And at the same time, you also work, you're internationally recognized as a LinkedIn specialist and what you call an online presence mentor. And you've coached almost 2,000 entrepreneurs, some of them introverts, some of them not. So there's all sorts of ways to move in the world. And between your work on the Introvert Biz Growth podcast, and now you're starting this whole gentle business revolution, right? That's the title?
Yes.
Yeah. So you are doing it. And if you impact one person, Sarah, like one person who's an introvert learns how to be more effective in the world, say that person is our listener who is a nurse leader, and she actually impacts other introverts or non-introverts who are in her family or her community or her workplace, that's going to ripple out, don't you think?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. That's why I'm doing this work. Yes, definitely.
That's your superpower, right?
I hope so.
I see one of your superpowers, I think, is your ability to, as an introvert, do such incredible work in the world and touch so many people. I mean, you've coached almost 2,000 people, right? So there's something to what you're able to accomplish in the world and do it in what I see as an extremely gentle and authentic way.
Yeah, It's funny because my dad was a political leader. He was always involved in politics when I grew up, and he was definitely like much more introverted than me. But I saw this power, that a gentle power, he was in the social politics, and somehow it took me all these years to realize that I'm not actually betraying him being now on the business side, because he was always representing the workers, right? And so
yes.
basically the entrepreneurs, the business owners, that was the enemy, or that was like the people who were abusing the workers. And so it took me all these years to make peace with that and realize, well, I have my own role to play here. And I, still I'm my dad's daughter, and I have the same kind of rebel genes in me. And that's, I guess, why this gentle business revolution was born. Yeah.
Right. And maybe you'll impact someone who starts a gentle political revolution. Who knows?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
That would just be wonderful.
Wouldn't that be nice? I mean,
yes.
Here in the United States, I know you live in Switzerland, in beautiful Geneva, right? So
Right.
Here in the US, we had an election in, not very long ago in 2018, and we have all these, especially women of color, coming into Congress, for instance. It's very historical, and they're bringing a very different presence to the United States government and how that particular branch functions, the legislative branch of our three-part government. And that in and of itself, not that they're necessarily introverts, some of them might be, but the fact that they're bringing a more gentle, what I see, reasoned opinions and way of being in the world to that particular setting, I think that can be very powerful anywhere.
Yeah.
Right.
No, like I'm telling you, I see signs everywhere that the time is right, and people keep thinking, oh, this is the end, and it's just everything is horrible. But in history, it always had to be like that. It always had to go to this extreme situation in order to, go back to something different, because otherwise, why change if it's fine? So,
right. It's that's right. It's kind of like that metaphor of, it's like everybody's talking in capital letters and the introverts want to talk in small case letters. I just thought of that metaphor. You can use it, no charge.
Okay, good.
But it's kind of like an all caps world, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
And I think those of us who don't want to live and speak and be in the world in all caps, then we can create a world where speaking in lowercase letters is okay, and speaking in a quiet voice. Was it Teddy Roosevelt said, speak quietly and carry a big stick? I think it was something like that. And I think it was Teddy Roosevelt. So he knew how to not necessarily be loud, but he actually carried a stick behind his back, metaphorically. So that's a whole nother story. So you introverts out there, carry a stick. Maybe it'll get you somewhere. Now, Sarah, I know you have your husband, Tony, right? He's from California, correct?
No, he's from Canada.
Canada, right. And, you all used to live in California, and you have 3 boys. Yes. And how old are your boys now?
I have 2 boys. I don't know about the third one yet, but there's 2. And they're 12 and 15.
Okay. In your, somehow in this bio I have, it says you have 3 boys. Maybe that includes your husband.
Oh, yes. That's, yes.
He's the other boy.
He's the other boy. Yes.
Now
the boys, they never grow up.
That's true. Peter Pan boys, right? So Are your 2 boys introverted or are they extroverted?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my eldest is definitely introverted. Simon, he's very much my dad, really. It's like every time I look at him, like, oh my God, there's my dad. Right. And so he's also more like me. And then Diego, the smaller one, I would say he's an ambivert. He likes the company, but he also just likes to cuddle up in his bed with a book. So,
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ambiverts unite.
Yes. Yeah.
I love ambiverts because we can be chameleons, and
Yeah.
that can be kind of fun, right?
And I actually think that most introverts have, this ability to be an ambivert. I know that I can. It's not where I'm most comfortable, but I can definitely be very social.
Yeah.
And because I'm an INFJ, so I have the feeling part in me that makes me connect very easily to people. So I'm not shy at all. So yeah, I definitely feel like an ambivert sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to put a link actually to Myers-Briggs, to an article about it or something online, so people can look up what INFJ means, or,
right.
Whatever we happen to be. Or you can also take the test online and get that. And of course, it's a generalization, but it can be a really helpful way to look at yourself. And it's a good way to look inside. And, I mentioned fun a few minutes ago. And what do you and your 3 boys, what do y'all do for fun in Switzerland and beyond?
Right. Well, I won't say as typical introverts, but I do think as introverts, we're not like big on, group sports. So for example, both my boys never got into soccer, where most boys, even at least here in Europe, they're much into soccer, and they're like, no, that's just not good. So the Simon, he does martial arts, so that's a one-person sport, right? And then Diego, he's more into music, so he does drumming. And Tony and Tony does martial arts too. And I like yoga. I do Tai Chi once a week. And yeah, so like very, kind of lonely, not lonely because that means that kind of has a sad connotation, but solo sports. Yes. Yeah.
Solitary, not lonely. Right. And I know you all love to travel. You have a home in Sicily that you go to periodically.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yes.
I've seen pictures, and I hope we can stay there someday. And, I know you like yoga, you all like nature, and there's incredible nature in Switzerland. So there's no shortage of places where you can go and be alone out in beautiful, beautiful locations.
Yes. Yeah.
So that must be lovely.
Yeah, it's true that the traveling, it's funny that we met traveling. So I was traveling in Spain, and Tony came from Canada to do the backpacking that, most Canadians do when they're out of college. And so that's when we met, and we kept in touch. And then 2 years later, he moved to Switzerland. And of course, before the kids, we still traveled a lot because we both really enjoyed that.
Sure.
Now a bit less, but still, yeah, it's one of our. And just yesterday, actually, we had this conversation about traveling. It's great for introverts because you get to socialize, with people from the country, but you don't really feel like you have to attach, like there's no like long-term commitment, right?
Right.
And so for an introvert, that is great because introverts are usually very selective with their friends. So, I have probably 4 or 5 really good friends, but I'm not a big fan of groups. So I'm not part of any groups. And that's the thing when you keep traveling. Well, you don't really have this one group that with these people that have known since you went to kindergarten.
Sure,
and most of my friends, that's what they have or had, right? Where I chose to move away from my hometown and then just kept on moving. And so yeah, it's very typical for an introvert to like traveling, actually.
Right. And being in a place where you don't speak much of the language can be really helpful. So if you know 15 words, those are the 15 words you're going to use. And the rest of the time you're just observing, right? Or smiling at people, or writing in your journal, or, so there's plenty of ways to be in the world. And that's one way. And, for just really quickly before we end, going back to our nurse who's listening, if that person is in a position where they feel uncomfortable and they just can't get comfortable in their own skin in a large organization or a large unit, my advice would be Maybe it's time to look for a job where you work solo. Maybe you do telephone triage, or you're a consultant and you work from home like I do. I can be in my pajamas a lot of the time during the day.
Right.
And, I can hop on Skype and put a nice shirt on. But, you can find ways to be effective in the world and maybe differently than other people. And I think that's where this gentle business revolution comes in. This is where the Introvert Biz Growth podcast comes in. And if people want to learn more about what you do and the services you offer and your LinkedIn specialization and all those things, they can go to sarahsantacroce.com, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and that's Sarah is Sarah, and Santacroce is Santa, like Santa Claus, and Croce, Croce. That'll be in the show notes at nursekeith.com/the-word episode and the number 206. And Sarah, it's so great to have you here. You've been on some of my other podcasts, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day over there in Geneva and being with us and bringing your wisdom here.
Thank you so much for having me. Can I just add one more thing?
Yes, ma'am.
For the nurses that are in this job, right? The introverted nurses, and maybe they can't change right now. It's just not an option that they see possible. So sometimes, I think it was Liz Gilbert who said, sometimes we're all after this search for passion, but sometimes the passion is outside of the job and you just really just have a job, right? So, we can look at it that way as well, and then just find something that you are really passionate about outside of the job. And then since you still spend 8 hours per day in your job, well, what I would do, and what I was so surprised, or more as a nurse, especially. Yeah. What I was really surprised that Tony, started, I didn't say you should do this, but he saw me meditating, and eventually he's like, oh, can you give me some of those meditations on my phone? Mm-hmm. And so that's what he does now at lunch, right? Because when everybody else, gets together and has lunch together and they talk, of course, more business, he's like, okay, I'm gone. He grabs his lunch and he goes up the mountain and just meditates.
Good for him. That's
find
great.
Those 20 minutes to be by yourself. I think it's really important.
And that nurse who's listening right now is like, yeah, right. I get about 5 minutes to myself in a 12-hour shift and I don't even get a lunch break. That is a whole nother conversation that I will have on the show many, many more times. But that's a great final takeaway, is to find the ways that you can get the time you need to recharge your batteries, right?
Maybe it needs to be in the commute then. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
But don't close your eyes.
That's right. Don't close your eyes. Don't play a meditation tape while you're driving. No. So thank you, Sarah. And be careful out there with those meditation tapes, okay?
Thanks.
Thank you so much. There you have it. Thank you for listening to the Nurse Keith Show. Remember that the show notes for this episode are at nursekeith.com/the-word episode and the number 206. Remember to check out those show notes and visit Sarah Santacroce, connect with her on LinkedIn, check out her podcast and all the wonderful work she's doing in the world. She's just an amazing human being and a good friend. I hope you feel uplifted and empowered from this episode, and I encourage you to take inspired, possibly introspective action every day in the interest of your satisfaction and your career development. The Nurse Keith Show is edited and produced by Tim Hollowell and his team at thepodcastinggroup.com, and social media and promotion are handled by Mark Cappy-Speason. Stay positive, care for yourself and others, take inspired action in the interest of your career, and tune in again as we explore how to take your life and your career to the next level. Be well, dig deep, seek joy, keep in touch. This is Nurse Keith, and I am signing off from beautiful Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Sarah Santacroce in
Switzerland.
Geneva, Switzerland. All right, Sarah, thank you. Thank you, and we will be back. See me next time on the other side.